Last week, I did a video, and you can watch it on the channel. They lied about your aperture, and this whole aperture equivalence thing is nonsense. And we did some tests where I took my Nikon ZF and my Olympus Micro Four Thirds, 50 mil on the full frame, and a 50 mil equivalent on the Micro Four Thirds, okay? And so we did these tests, and there was no question that the 50 mil on Micro Four Thirds had more bokeh. But the whole context of this is that people keep pushing this idea of aperture equivalence, and aperture equivalence isn't real. And I caught a lot of flack by a lot of these YouTube photographers. When I started in photography, bokeh was not even a term they threw around that much. And another commenter left a very insightful comment on that video, because a lot of the old timers were like, wow, finally somebody coming out against this stupidity of aperture equivalence. We didn't even used to talk about bokeh. Everyone was not always panic buying to see, if they could get a tiny bit more bokeh, a little wider aperture. My best portraits typically have some background. Yes, I like blur and I like bokeh as much as the next guy. And so, we looked and talked about these different lenses in this video, but then the comments came because this video got some traction on the channel and a lot of new people were seeing it. I don't just want to be mean in the comment. I don't want to gatekeep. I don't want to make people think like, oh, it's not good enough. But this idea, people were arguing with me saying, no, that's not true. A 50 mil lens lets in more light. On full frame, you get more light. And I was reading these comments and just kind of blown away with what people are saying. The exposure, I kept trying to say, the exposure is exactly the same on medium format, on full frame, on Micro Four Thirds. In the film days, you didn't call a 35 millimeter camera a crop sensor. Now, understand that the norm was that Hasselblad back there. The norm was a medium format. No one called a 35 mil a crop sensor. That was also invented for digital, and 35 kind of became the standard because in the general rule, 35 millimeter is the big normal sensor. In the early days, everything was crop sensors, quote, crop sensors. Then full frame came out and that kind of became the standard. And so we kind of use focal length equivalent of like, this is the 35 millimeter equivalent as that average. So a 25 mil lens on Micro Four Thirds is not a wide angle. It's a 50 mil equivalent because this is a 2x crop in relation to full frame. I actually had a pretty popular video on this a few years back, and I'll link it in the comments, where I was taking all these lenses in particular, in this case for the Fuji system, I was comparing all these little primes at their different focal lengths in these situations so that you could really feel like how the different focal lengths felt next to each other. I will link that in the comments if you want to watch it after this. So you could say, okay, fine, focal equivalence is useful because when we're talking about, because there's so many sensor sizes and we have phones and we have full frame and we have 1.6 crop and 2x crop, having 35 as the standard because it's the most common, not only in digital, but even throughout the past 100 years of photography, it's the most prolific. It's fair to say that 35 millimeter is a good standard to use focal length reference from. What is a lie is aperture equivalence, but I don't need to do that whole video over. You can go watch it if you don't believe me, because some of the comments are wild in there. And I took the same lens because people did make a few valid points. They're like, I said, basically you get the same bokeh if I put the 50 on the full frame and then I adapt that 50 using a vintage lens. I was using an Olympus and a Pentax vintage lens, I think. If I adapt that 50 to the Micro Four Thirds, I can just use my feet and step back, and also you get that 51.4 on Micro Four Thirds. It's now 100 mil equivalent. Works great, right? And it does, by the way. There was an implication that you get virtually the same or the same bokeh with that 50 mil on the Micro Four Thirds. And yes, it's exact same lens. No, this idea that you get more light on a full frame is nonsense. The sensor covers more area, therefore the lens has to be bigger to let in more volume of light because it's covering more area. But that is completely irrelevant to how photography actually works in terms of aperture being a measurement of how we measure light in metering. Because in relation to the sensor size, the amount of light hitting the sensor is exactly the same. The lens can be smaller because it doesn't have to spread that light. Think a projector. As you move it away, it gets dimmer, right? It doesn't have to spread the light over more area, but the amount of light hitting the sensor at 1.4 on full frame versus 1.4 on crop sensor is exactly the same. The exposure is exactly the same. There's no equivalence. So they said, oh no, you're full of it, Gavin. In reality, even with that 50 mil on your Micro Four Thirds, you have to step back more to get the same framing. Therefore, you have more distance and you're getting less background blur. That's actually true. Therefore, they said you still have like an f4. That's not true. And so even though I didn't do that in the video, I went back and I tested that. And what I did here to make sure I got it right, I set the Hasselblad on a tripod and used my cluttered background. I didn't try and do a portrait with this one. I just ran this, okay? I used the same exposure settings. Now, yes, on some of these, the wide open version has a little less contrast. It's not as sharp. That's a question of the lens. That's why modern lenses, I think, are so big, because they're trying to make these huge elements, even on, quote, crop sensors, so that we can get it sharp and contrasty and clear and bright, which then brought in the concept of like T-stops. People are like, oh, f-stops aren't the real measurement anyhow. T-stops are. They measure the amount of light actually getting through and hitting the sensor, and f-stops don't. That's kind of true in that T-stops, which are used for cinema lenses, are more precise because they measure the actual light getting through the lens, whereas the f-stop is based on the size of the opening in relation to the focal length. But T-stops aren't how we measure light in still photography. T-stops don't exist on most of your meters or lenses. They're on very expensive cinema lenses because they wanted those cinema lenses to be super accurate. I would guess they wanted them to be super accurate between shots. So if they changed lenses, one lens at f1.4 on a photography lens and another lens at f1.4 might have slightly different amounts of light coming through to them because their actual transmission differs based on how the lens formula and the optics and how many lens groups and all that they had. But all this is kind of just people talking hyperbole online, because that's not how light is measured in still photography. We use f-stops, but we don't use f-stops to measure bokeh. F-stops are the measurement of light. So here's the Micro Four Thirds with a 50 mil 1.4 wide open, f2.8, and f4. And I actually wrote it on the paper to make sure I didn't get them confused in each one, right? And stuck it on there. Now we go to the full frame. Here is the 50 mil at 1.4 on the Nikon ZF. Same settings, right? And yes, I know, and if you look at the metadata, it says 1.8, but that's just because the lens is adapted. It's not an electronic lens. This is a vintage lens that I'm using for this test, so I could use the same lens on both cameras, right? 50 mil 1.4. Now, it's kind of soft, but don't look at that. Don't look at the contrast. We're talking about the blur. There's definitely more blur on here, and I had to double my length. So I was like 4 feet away with the 50 mil to get this framing, and to get the same framing on Micro Four Thirds, I had to move to like 7 or 8 foot away. I had to double the distance because it's a 2x crop. The 50 mil on a Micro Four Thirds is 100 mil, right? Now these same things would apply close to a Fuji, even though a Fuji kind of falls in between full frame. And most crop sensors, APS-C style sensors, let's call them, they fall in between Micro Four Thirds and full frame, okay? But let's actually look. Is it actually an f4? No, it's not. Let's take a real test. 1.4 at Micro Four Thirds and f4. Everybody's like, oh, that's actually an f4. No, it's not. Same amount of light. Obviously different sensors. Little bit of a different response because of how those sensors work and how wide open the lens were and things like that. But here's an f4, and these are all raw straight out of camera. I didn't do anything on these ones, which is why you're seeing subtle variance depending on the lens and the sensor and stuff like that. 50 mil, obviously it's a lot sharper, right, throughout at f4. But look at the bokeh. Let's go back here to these little things on my shelf and cameras and light being reflected. You can see on the left is Micro Four Thirds at 1.4, and on the right is on the Nikon ZF, same 50 mil lens on a full frame at f4. Way more bokeh. Look at the size of the balls on the reflections back here. In fact, let's go back again. Let's take the f2.8. Now we've switched sides. On the right, we have the M43, and on the left, we have the same lens, 50 mil at f2.8, and on the right is f1.4. Again, let's look at the bokeh. More bokeh. Look at the size of these balls in particular down here where these light balls are reflecting. So yes, I had to step twice the distance away, but aperture equivalence is still not a thing. And this is going to vary in how this feels and how good the bokeh feels depending on the lens. In real life, like I know normally you would say, hey, I want to shoot 50, so I'm going to put a 25. That's what I showed in the original video, a 25 on Micro Four Thirds and a 50 on full frame to give the same field of view. But even if you put the exact same lens on these, even if you put the exact same lens on both. Yes, you have to step back further to get the same field of view on Micro Four Thirds because it's a 2x crop, and you would have to stop like, half that distance on an APS-C sensor. Aperture equivalence still is BS. The light reaching coming through is the same on both. It's your f1.4 is actually an f4. No, it's not. Bokeh isn't rated in stop, so it's dumb to even say that. There's not a stop in a bokeh. Does the f-stop affect the bokeh in relation to its focal length? Yes, but bokeh isn't a measurements in photography. This obsession with bokeh is not what makes good photos, and once again, there's no equivalence. In last week's video, I did the same framing, one with a 50 on full frame and one with a 25 on Micro Four Thirds. Same distance from the subject. And yes, for that reason, there was a little less bokeh on the 25. It's a 25, not a 50. What I'm clarifying on this week's video is if we put that same 50mm vintage lens on both, we obviously, in this case, have to move back to get the same relative field of view. And because of the focus distance, there's going to be less blur on the Micro Four Thirds. Not because the sensor or the lens changed or the lights hitting the sensor is different, but because we moved away. So that's a creative choice. You could still get the same relative blur by moving closer. Are there some other tiny differences between the Micro Four Thirds and the full frame? Well, yes, because it's only using the center of the lens. So it's actually using the brightest area of the lens. In effect, in relation to the sensor, when you use that bigger lens on a Micro Four Third, you arguably get a little more light hitting the sensor and a little more exposure, especially wide open like this, because as you can see on its native full frame view, we're getting more vignetting on this older lens wide open. This, of course, is going to vary by lens and things like that, and again, is not something worth stressing about. The bokeh is the same on a 50mm full frame, that same 50mm on a Micro Four Thirds, on an APS-C, exact same bokeh if you're at the same distance. The only thing that's changing in these things is the focal length. A 25mm on Micro Four Thirds is giving less bokeh than a 50mm on full frame because it's a shorter focal length. And yes, when you put that 50mm on a Micro Four Thirds and it's now a 100mm equivalent, you probably are going to step back more, and so you're going to get a little less bokeh. But again, the aperture equivalence isn't true because the difference, while it is real, if you double your distance to the subject, you're going to get a little less blur in the background. It's not what they say it is. And we just proved that, I think, once again. I know there's going to be somebody inventing some math in the comments and talking about something that's not actually taught when you're studying photography of like, well, this works this way and this, and then distance and times ratio. And they do all this complex stuff to try and explain it because we're not studying photography as a whole. We're not studying the fundamentals of photography. So, I could sit here and I could talk about all these different lenses and cameras and sensor sizes and combinations and how I process them and what lens and how much blur. Photos aren't actually defined by how much blur is there. That's mostly something that was promoted for marketing to sell you bigger and bigger lenses every year and make you think like you need them to be a good photographer. In reality, the bokeh, or bokeh, I get scolded for how I say it too, is not the critical factor. The emotion, the light, the shadow, the line, the expression. And in fact, the smaller sensor cameras have an advantage in some areas that's important in that they give more depth of field. Sometimes that's better. You can look at the side-by-side samples and say, oh, well, there's a difference between full frame and Micro Four Thirds or APS-C, all things being equal. Sure, there's a difference. The focal lengths are different. It's not an aperture equivalence. There's a difference in blur, but if blur is really that important to you, if that's really your thing, if you think that's really what makes a great photo, you better go buy a medium format, because honestly, compared to that, you need the 35mm is an aperture equivalent, right? Because the medium format with the same field of view is a longer lens and going to give you much more bokeh. And if that's what really matters to you, yeah, you better go medium format. You see what I mean? This never ends. The gear is not what makes you a great photographer. And that's why I wanted to come back and do a little follow-up on this. And so I hope those images came across. If you want a more visual comparisons, go watch my original video I did, because I know this one was kind of off the cuff, just looking at examples in Lightroom. And I did a lot more production on the other one to show a lot more different image examples and things like that. All right, peace.